Hey guys, this should be a fun one. BLUETTI has just introduced this Apex 300 power station, and I was lucky enough to get my hands on this pre-release version several weeks ago for testing, and now I can finally talk about it, and I've frankly been dying to talk about it because this thing seems to have cracked the code for modular power stations that can act equally well as a portable power station and a home backup power solution. So over the past 3 or 4 years, I've tested a variety of these kinds of power stations. When it comes to putting them in a home backup power kind of role, there always seems to be a bit of an Achilles heel there, that in order to output 240 volts, you have to put two of these units in parallel with some beefy cables, and then you have to carefully balance the load across both units, because if each unit has to have its dedicated battery stack and you let one of them fully deplete its batteries, well then you're out of luck on the 240 volt output entirely. And then C, when it comes to recharging via AC, the vast majority of these units require you to recharge them at 240 volts if you're currently connected in parallel and outputting 240 volts. So if you needed to utilize 120 volts AC for charging, you'd have to take them out of a parallel connection and basically separate them and then charge them individually. And obviously you can't continue to output 240 volts when you're doing that. And all of that still manages to work reasonably well. It's just, a little bit more complicated than most people would probably prefer to have to deal with. But now this Apex 300, BLUETTI finally has a solution that natively outputs 240 volts without needing to put two of these units in parallel to get that. And it'll charge at 120 volts even when it's in 240 volt output mode. And that's kind of a big deal if that actually works. So we're going to test it out and see for ourselves if it actually does work. But before we jump into all that, bear with me for just a couple more minutes because there's quite a lot to cover on the specs and capabilities of this beast, along with the input and output ports and things like that, so we can get a sense of what this new Apex 300 is really all about. So first of all, on the inside, it's using automotive-grade prismatic lithium iron phosphate cells that are rated to maintain at least 80% of their original capacity after a massive 6,000 full charge and discharge cycles. And it comes with a rated capacity of about 2,764 watt hours. So unlike the AC300 and the AC500 units that I've reviewed, which have no internal capacity of themselves without adding expansion batteries, this Apex 300 is fully functional all by itself. But like the AC300 and the AC500 units, it's fully compatible with BLUETTI's B300, B300K, and B300S expansion battery options, enabling you to expand the capacity of just a single Apex 300 to a very hefty 19.3 kilowatt hours. Now, the total output power of a single Apex 300 is 3,840 watts, but if you really need more output power than that, like for a whole home type of setup, you can put up to 3 of these Apex 300s in parallel, which would give you a full 11.5 kilowatts of output and a crazy max capacity of up to 58 kilowatt hours. But all of that said, I think the base output of 3,840 watts is going to be sufficient for most people if you're thinking in terms of critical loads rather than whole house backup. And I'll demonstrate why that is just a little bit later in the video. All right, now taking a close-up look at the output ports, you can see here on the front that it's got 4 120 20 amp outlets. And yes, those do all still work when you're in 240 volt output mode, which you can easily control right up here with a physical switch, which activates the secondary AC inverter. And I love that they provide a physical switch for that, so you don't have to jump in and navigate through a menu interface to enable it. And you can just flip the switch and you're good to go. It's also got a physical switch for eco mode and a selector switch that let you choose between 3 different charging speeds. So for all of you out there who really prefer not to mess around with the mobile app, BLUETTI has designed this Apex 300 to be easy to operate without the mobile app. Now, of course, they do have mobile app control, and we'll take a closer look at that here shortly, but the point is, you don't have to use the mobile app for these key functions if you prefer not to. Now, moving on to the left side of the unit, you can see there's a threaded grounding port. The 120 volt AC input is also located there, along with an overload breaker reset for those 20 amp AC outlets on the front. And then below those, you have 3 large covered ports. And on the left end is a really interesting connection that provides both input and output for both 120 volt and 240 volt at up to 50 amps. And they actually have an optional accessory cable that would allow you to connect this to a level 2 EV charger to fast charge this unit using that particular port, which could be super handy for a lot of people. But the other function of this connector is to enable parallel connections to other Apex 300s for expanding that max power output. Now, to the right of that port is an RV30 or a NEMA TT30 120 volt 30 amp outlet. And that makes it easy for hooking up campers that use the RV30 connection. And then on the right side, there's a NEMA 1450 outlet. That's your typical electric dryer, electric range style outlet. But keep in mind that while this outlet is rated for 50 amps, you can only get about 30, maybe 32 amps through it with a single Apex 300 due to that 3840 watt output max. And then finally, on the opposite side of the unit, there are a couple of XT60 DC inputs that are primarily for solar, of course, but you can certainly use them for things like car charging or other DC fast charging. And the input voltage range on these particular ports is 12 volts up to a max of 60 volts on each port with a cap of 20 amps and a maximum of 1200 watts. And again, that is on each port. So using both ports, you can put up to 2400 watts of solar into this unit. And then next to that XT60 set of inputs is the battery expansion cascade port. Now, if you were paying close attention, you probably noticed that the Apex 300 doesn't have any native USB or even a 12 volt car accessory socket, which is kind of a little surprising, I have to admit. But there is an accessory that BLUETTI is calling the Hub D1, kind of a strange name, but that apparently provides a variety of DC outputs, including two 12 volt car accessory sockets, two 5521 barrel connectors, two 15 watt USB-As and two 100 watt USB-Cs, and then also a 50 amp DC Anderson port, which is pretty cool, but just be aware that this is an add-on accessory. It doesn't come with a standard Apex 300, but if you do add one or more of the B300 expansion batteries, for example, those actually do have both USB and a 12 volt 10 amp car socket built right into that expansion module. So for many people, that might be all that you need. And then finally, you'll want to be aware that there's no area light or wireless phone charging built into this unit either. Okay, enough spec talk. Let's go put this thing to use and see how it actually performs. All right, let's start off with our typical usable capacity test. And since there are no direct DC outputs available on this power station without that Hub D1 option, we're just going to do it with AC output and test the inverter. So since this has a 3840 watt rated continuous output inverter, we're going to run this at approximately 0.2C, which would equate to just under 800 watts. So let me go ahead and start adding a load. I've got this switch voltage selector here set to 120 volts. It really could be set either way, but I don't want to activate the other inverter for this test. So I'm going to do 120 volts, and we'll go ahead and turn that inverter on with the AC switch. That will power our AC outputs here. And let's see, we are outputting 120 volts. Excellent. And we're currently at 1152 watts. So we want to reduce that. And that gets us down to a pretty close to a 0.2C discharge rate. So let's let this thing run all the way down till the BMS shuts us off. And we'll plug this in and find out how many watt hours we actually get out of this Apex 300. All right, looks like our usable capacity test out of that AC inverter is done. Let me go ahead and just first check the state of charge to see what it says. And we are at 0%. Plug the meter into grid power and read what we ended up with. All right, 2,430 watt hours out of a rated 2,764.8 watt hours. So that is a above average 87.9% of rated capacity. And again, if you've watched my other videos, you know that typically the number I get on average is somewhere between 80 and 85%, 80, 84%, something like that. So
yeah, 220, 221, whatever it takes.
87.9 is definitely an above average number and very good performance in terms of usable capacity out of this AC inverter. I'll be very interested to see what the no load draw ends up being on this particular inverter. And I think I'll probably test that on 120 volt and 240 volt settings, you know, for my own curiosity to see if there's a difference there. All right, let's get this thing charged back up and do some more testing. All right, let's do a wake and charge test on this Apex 300 and make sure if we have solar attached and this thing is basically fully depleted. We're only at 3% right now. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the AC inverter on and just let the parasitic draw take this thing down. We are inputting about 15 watts right now, which is kind of surprising because there's not much sun out at all. All right, so We're going to check back in the morning and see if this thing has awakened itself and began to charge without any intervention on my part. All right, it is the next day. It's actually almost 12:30 in the afternoon because I couldn't get out here this morning. But as you can see, this thing did wake up and start charging itself. In fact, we're almost 32% charged here at midday, and we're pulling in 321 watts. So unattended wake up and charge function definitely confirmed and passed. By the way, since we're talking about solar panels and solar charging, that power station, I finally got my hands on a BLUETTI portable solar panel. This is the very first one. This is their PV200D solar panel. It's an ETFE coated foldable 200 watt solar panel. And I'll give you the specs on that in just a second, but let's get this thing set up and see if there's anything interesting or unique about this particular portable solar panel. All right, so the first thing I noticed is that there's kind of a unique positioning system built into this leg stand. So you can control what the angle is based on what snap that you put this on. So you can lay it flatter the higher up you put this snap. So let's put this right about here, which they say is plus or minus 5 degrees, close to 45 degree. And I guess we'll have to do that with each panel, or with each leg stand. Inside here, we've got just a standard MC4 type cable. So nice heavy gauge cable. This is 12 gauge cable. And we look down here, it does use ETFE coating. And the voltage open circuit is 24.6 volts, and the short circuit current is 10.8 amps. So I like the fact that they give you that right on the panel, so if you ever are in question about whether or not you're putting too much voltage together for your configuration, you can check it out right there. All right, let's go ahead and unsnap these guys on the side. Yeah, so there are a total of 3 legs to this thing, and still keeps it plenty flat. There's really no need for that 4th one that would be behind this panel if you were going to add one. But yeah, this feels really nice and rugged. So I think this thing would probably stand up to a pretty significant amount of abuse. So let's go ahead and hook this thing up to the Apex 300 and see what kind of output we're getting out of this 200 watt panel. It's about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. The sun is pretty well overhead. Make sure I have this flattened out. Looks about right. Yeah, so let's see what we can get. We're getting 162 watts out of this 200 watt panel. All right, with that approximate 24 volts open circuit rating, we could add a second one of these and put it in series with this one, and we would have somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 48 volts. That's under the 60 volt max of the Apex 300 for each individual port. Or we could just actually plug one of these into each of the 2 separate MPPT charge controllers, because each one of those XT60 connectors on the side has its own charge controller. So we could either just do that, we could plug them in separately, or string them together in series. I think that's what we'll do. Let's go ahead and string them together in series and then just kind of see what kind of output we're getting from that. All right, I've got the 2 sets of panels here, and here are the leads from each. So to connect them in series, all we got to do, doesn't matter which set of leads we pick, but we just match them up with one set, and that leaves the other set open. And that takes the voltage of each panel and multiplies it or adds them together. So 24 and change volts open circuit plus 24 gives us probably about 48 volts open circuit out of this series connection here. And I will just simply plug these into the connection to the power station, and we'll see what we get. We are getting 344 watts. So we're getting 344 watts out of the combo of these 2 200 watt BLUETTI portable solar panels. That's not too bad. All right, now just to kind of give you a kind of a rule of thumb, when you're trying to estimate how much charge capacity you can get out of a solar panel, you basically take its rated output, so in this case 200 watts, and you multiply that by, depending on where you live, somewhere between a factor of 4 or a factor of 5. In ideal conditions, you might use 5. Less than ideal conditions, you might use 4, somewhere in between. So we have a combined 400 watts of rated power, and if we use 5 as a multiplier, that would give us 400 times 5, or 2,000 watt hours of charge capacity in a full day of decent sky conditions on average. So that's a pretty good rule of thumb. So 400 watts of solar for this Apex 300, if you're relying on solar with a single Apex 300, is only going to give you about 2,000 watt hours of recharge capacity in a good day of sun. And that is not enough with that 3,800 and whatever it is watt hour capacity. That's going to get you probably, at best case scenario, about 50% or maybe just a little over 50% of charge capacity. So just be aware of that. I think for something like this Apex 300, you'd want to put at least 800 watts on this if you had a single unit and you wanted to be able to fully recharge it in a single day of sun. And like I said, it is rated to handle up to 1,200 watts of solar on each of those XT60 ports. And if you start expanding with the expansion batteries, you're going to want more solar. And BLUETTI does have an accessory for that. I forget the name of it here, but I'll have to put it down here for you. But it allows you to put significantly more solar input into this power station by using that. So if that's something that you wanted to do, there is a solution for that, still using this Apex 300. All right, I wanted to take a moment and show you how this thing really does shine as a home backup power solution. But before we jump into that, I did get a Hub D1 here, and that's this guy right over here. Let's take a closer look at that. So how this thing actually works is it connects to one of these P090D ports here, the expansion battery ports, and it is compatible with the B300K and the B300 batteries, and it's also compatible with the Apex 300 directly. And it should be future compatible with anything that BLUETTI produces that has that P090D battery expansion port. All right, so this thing is capable of outputting a total of 700 watts. And then over here on the side here, this is outputting up to 600 watts. And this is basically a large Anderson style connector that can give you DC out, again, up to 600 watts. And if supplying a 12 volt system, that'll be up to 50 amps or up to 25 amps if it's a 24 volt output that you're getting from this. And then, by the way, this is just clamped on here with a little handle that can be removed. And it's just a little spring loaded. It can be wall mounted as well, but it is nicely designed to just clamp right there on the handle of either the B300K or the Apex 300. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, it does have the 12 volt 10 amp car sockets here, also including these 5521 barrel connectors here. The maximum for all four of these connectors output is 120 watts. So each individual port can output a maximum of 120 watts, but if I'm using, say, two of these 12 volt sockets at the same time, I can't pull more than 120 watts total. And same goes with these DC 5521s. And then just a little further to the right here, we've also got the USB-C ports. The ones on the top are USB PD 100 watt outputs, and then the ones on the bottom are 18 watt outputs. These are USB-A ports. And by the way, these are both combined at a max of 18 watts, either individually or combined. So if I'm just charging one device off a USB-C, I get the full 18 watts. Or if I'm putting two USB-C devices there, I'm kind of splitting that 18 watts between the two devices. All right, so that's a quick tour of the Hub D1. All right, now back to the home power backup use case. So I've got a B300K on top, and I've got a couple of B300 battery expansions beneath the Apex 300, and it's compatible with either. Now, I do think the B300K battery expansion is probably going to be the sweet spot from BLUETTI's perspective, and I think that's probably going to be reflected in the bundle pricing that BLUETTI puts together for this Apex 300. I think that's going to mostly involve the B300K, and it is a more compact expansion battery, even though it still does offer a pretty generous 2,764 watt hours. Now, you compare that, that's exactly the same output or watt hour capacity of the Apex 300. But one of the reasons that I was talking about how I felt that the Apex 300 had kind of cracked the code for home power backup solutions is that 3,840 watts of continuous output, you might not think that that's enough for critical circuits. And if you're including things like an electric water heater or an electric clothes dryer, including things like central air, those things will not run on a single Apex 300. You would have to string multiple units together to run those things. But if you're just running a window air conditioner to make sure that you're keeping one particular space cool, and you're trying to run maybe your home office and your internet router and your entertainment system and your refrigerator, if you have a gas furnace, for example, that's only going to run somewhere around 600 to 650 watts while the furnace blower is running and it's actually producing heat. And so that still would be able to be accommodated by this. So in the wintertime, I can get my gas furnace running off of this as well. All of those things which I consider to be part of my critical circuits, I can easily run with that. And this thing does have, as I showed you before, it's got that NEMA 1450 dryer plug style here. But if you take a look at my manual transfer switch, it's actually got an L1430, so it's got a 30 amp connector on it. So like the one that I showed you that I have out in my barn, it's got that 50 amp connector. The two that I have in my house have these 30 amp connectors, and these are the twist lock ones that you typically find with a lot of home gas generators. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in there, and how I connect that to the Apex 300 in this case is to simply use an adapter cable that's got the NEMA 1450P plug on one end, and then it's got the L1430R receptacle on the other end. And I just put that adapter on this cable. Now all I got to do is plug this into the side, and I'm ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the AC. I want to make sure I'm in 240 volt mode, right? And now I can see I've got a light on my cable. I know this is now energized. And now I can select what circuits I want to switch over. So I'm going to run my fridge off the generator, my family room, living room, and my office, my wife's office. And we're going to run that all off battery power. Now if we take a look, I do have my computer on. I'm sure my wife is actually up there working right now. So we'll take a look at the display. And what you can see is we're only pulling a total of 646 watts. Now that obviously is going to go up. If I'm doing gaming, my computer is going to start drawing probably another 300 or 400 watts than that. But I'm still somewhere around 1,000 watts. And maybe when my refrigerator kicks on, that's going to generate another 150 watts or maybe 200 watts or so temporarily. But the point is, all of this load is well below that 3,840 watt continuous rating on the AC inverter here. But just running these critical loads, my wife's office, my internet connection, my living room entertainment system, my refrigerator, all that stuff, I'm still well within the power load of this thing. And since I can easily add expansions to this with actually just the Apex and one B300K, I should be able to power those critical loads for at least a full 24 hours. And then if I wanted to extend that to a couple of days, I could add a second B300K or a third or a fourth or a fifth B300K expansion. And then I'm really in a position where in an emergency situation for an extended power outage, I've got it covered. So I really think this thing has cracked the code for essential home backup power. All right, just so I don't have to move this thing around any more than absolutely necessary, I brought my crotchety old guitar amp down here so I can do a quick noise test to see if the inverter output is suitable for things like PA systems and guitar amps and things like that as a remote power source, or if it generates too much noise. So as per usual, I'm going to do a baseline test. This is currently plugged into grid power, and let's hear how it sounds through grid power. All right, I will have boosted that 9 or 10 decibels so that you can kind of hear what it actually sounds like out of grid power. And I'll do the same thing when we plug it into the Apex 300. So let's do that. All right, now I've got it plugged into the inverter on the Apex 300. Let's see how it sounds. All right, I guess you'll have to be the judge, but from my ear, standing here in real time, I could not hear a difference between the inverter output on the Apex 300 versus grid power coming through this gnarly old guitar amp. So I would say that is a definite pass on the noise test. All right, let's do a UPS test on this to make sure that this UPS switchover function is fast enough to keep my gaming machine running. And if you can see on the display over here, we are basically inputting and outputting roughly the same amount. So I've got the gaming display and the computer and all of my gaming gear, including the sound system, all plugged into a surge strip through this one outlet right here. And then I've got grid power coming in on the left side of the unit. So we're going to simulate a power outage by pulling grid power and see if anything blips or restarts or shuts down. So here we go. 3, 2, 1. All right. Definitely survived the switchover to battery power. And you can see we're no longer inputting any power, we're just outputting. Let's see if it'll switch back gracefully. Going back to grid power. Here we go. Heard the relay. And we are now back on grid power. So, no problem at all. So UPS mode on this Apex 300, definite pass. So to quickly wrap up with some final comments, first I did do the inverter no load test on both the 120 volt and the 240 volt settings, and much to my surprise there really wasn't any difference. In both cases, the inverter, if left on with no load, will consume a surprisingly low 19 watts continuously, and that equates to I think about maybe 0.7% of overall battery capacity per hour. That's assuming no expansion batteries, of course, are attached. And I find that more than a little impressive given that the inverter on this thing is nearly 4 kilowatts, and I was really expecting something more in the mid 30 watt range or even higher since it does output 240 volt as well. But no, just 19 watts. So easily one of the best no-load draw results that I have seen. Now this unit is also one of the quietest power stations I have tested, and it seems to be equally quiet whether you are charging or discharging. So some of you guys really appreciate a quiet power station, and this is definitely one of them. Now the other thing that I really like about the Apex 300 is that you can charge it with 120 volts even while it is currently outputting 240 volts. And the only caveat really to that is that I did notice while testing that capability that if I was using the 120 volts through a GFCI outlet to charge it, it would trip that GFCI. Probably because that particular setup creates two ground neutral bond connections simultaneously. So just be aware of that particular limitation. But even still, the ability to charge via 120 volt while outputting 240 volts is kind of a big deal as far as convenience goes. There's just not many other solutions out there that will accommodate that, at least not without jumping through a bunch of hoops to get it to work. Now, some people might not be all that thrilled that it doesn't come with DC outputs built in, but do keep in mind that this unit is first and foremost positioned as a home backup power solution, and in that particular use case, DC outputs are really not a priority. Now that said, the fact that you can easily add a bunch of DC outputs, including a 12 volt 50 amp direct DC output with the addition of this Hub D1 module, I really think that makes this one of the most versatile power stations available right now. Because not only is this an extremely capable home backup power solution all by itself, and I might add significantly scalable to act as a whole house power solution if you ever wanted to expand it to that point, but if you're taking the camper or RV out for a week or maybe 4, you can easily take this Apex 300 along for the ride. You can toss in the Hub D1 and you're basically all set for just about anything. So I think if you're looking for a single solution that can very competently serve both of those use cases, I think you'd be hard pressed to come up with a better overall solution than this particular one, especially when you see the kind of early bird pricing deals that BLUETTI has on this thing during their Indiegogo crowdfunding launch campaign period. I literally just got this information as I was preparing my final comments for the video, and I nearly fell out of my chair when I saw these numbers. So in something that BLUETTI is calling their super early bird price bundle, you can get the Apex 300 and the B300K bundled together, including tax and including shipping for $19.99. Now, I realize that $19.99 is not a trivial dollar amount no matter what you're spending it on, but let's do a little math here. With the Apex 300 and the B300K bundle, you're basically getting a combined 5,530 watt hours of capacity with a 3.8 kilowatt 240 volt split phase inverter at a pre-tax cost of 32 cents per kilowatt.
Shut up and take my money!
Seriously, those are numbers you would typically only see in a super budget power station brand category, definitely not one of the big top tier brands like BLUETTI. So yeah, I find myself genuinely stunned by this deal. Oh, and since this total capacity of that particular bundle is well over 3 kilowatt hours, I believe this should also qualify for the 30% residential green energy tax credit, which would make this thing an absolute steal. So if you're thinking about a solution like this and you want to get more information on the Apex 300 and that Indiegogo campaign and that crazy super early bird pricing bundle, I'll leave a link to all that in the description below so you can go check it out if you want to. So what do you guys think? Is it just me, or are you as surprised and impressed by this as I am? Let me know in the comments. I'd really be interested in hearing what you guys have to say. And also, if you have any lingering questions about the Apex 300 that I haven't answered in the video for you, leave those in the comment section below as well, and I'll do my best to respond. Okay, I think that's a wrap. Hopefully you found something in the video helpful or maybe useful in some way. And if you did, please consider doing me a small favor and click that like button down below for me. It's free to do, and we'll both feel better about ourselves if you do it. So hey, thanks for spending some of your valuable time with me today, and I do hope you'll come back and join me for the next one. Until then, have fun out there.